The summer Lena Voss turned 23. She buried her father in ground so dry it cracked around the shovel blade. Nobody came to the funeral except old Phineas Croft, who had worked the mill with her father for 30 years and who stood with his hat pressed to his chest and said nothing the whole time, which was the kindest thing anyone did for her that week. The rest of Harlan County had their own troubles. The creek had dropped 3 feet since April. The corn was curling. People were looking at their own patch of sky and finding it empty, and they didn't have attention left over for a dead miller's daughter, standing beside a mound of pale dirt on a Wednesday afternoon. Her father, Thomas Voss, had left her 2 things, a debt on the mill and a piece of land nobody wanted. The debt was to Gerald Huck, who ran the grain co-op out of Millhaven, and who arrived at the house 4 days after the burial with a ledger under his arm and a look on his face like he'd already decided how the conversation would end. He sat at the kitchen table and laid out the numbers plainly. Her father had borrowed against the mill during the bad season 2 years prior. The interest had accumulated. The mill was Gerald Huck's now, or near enough that the distinction didn't matter. Lena listened. She asked 2 questions, both about the timing. Gerald Huck answered them without meeting her eyes. When he was gone, she sat in the kitchen for a long time. The house was quiet in the way houses get quiet when the person who made them feel like a home is gone. She could hear the clock on the mantel. She could hear a fly moving against the window glass. The land her father had left her was 40 acres on the eastern slope of the burnt ridge, 3 miles from the nearest road, with a seasonal creek that ran maybe 6 weeks out of the year, and a soil profile that 2 different men had described to her father as not worth the seed you'd put in it. One of those men had been a county extension agent. The other had been her uncle, who knew land the way some people know weather, from long attention and no illusions. She went out to look at it the following Monday. The ridge road was 2 ruts through scrub oak and juniper, and she drove it in her father's truck with the windows down because the truck had no air, and it was already 90 degrees by 9 in the morning. The land sat on a broad south-facing bench about halfway up the ridge, with the slope dropping away below it toward the valley and the main creek visible as a thin line of cottonwoods in the distance. The soil was thin and pale, calcareous, full of rock fragments that caught the light. There was an old stone foundation at the north end of the bench, maybe 12 feet by 20, where someone had started a structure long ago and given up. She walked the whole 40 acres that morning. She took a folding knife from her pocket and dug into the soil in a dozen places, noting the depth of the topsoil, the color changes at different layers, the way moisture distributed itself. Her father had taught her that. He had not been a farmer, but his father had been, and some of what the grandfather knew had come down through the father in the form of habits. The knife test, the smell of dirt after rain, the way you could tell a lot about a piece of ground just by watching where the water went when it finally came. What she found surprised her enough that she drove back the next day with a hand auger. The rock beneath the bench was limestone, fractured and layered, and in the lower fractures there was moisture even in late July, which was unusual. Her grandfather had told her once, sitting on the porch when she was maybe 9 years old, that limestone country held water different than clay country, that the water didn't sit on top, but moved through the rock itself, collecting in pockets and ledges deep below the surface, and that a person who understood that had something other people didn't. She hadn't known what he meant then. She thought she might know now. She didn't tell anyone what she was thinking. There was no one particularly to tell. She drove into Millhaven that afternoon and went to the county records office and spent 2 hours going through the geological survey maps for the eastern ridge. The woman at the desk brought her the file boxes without comment and went back to her work, and Lena spread the maps on the table and read them carefully. The limestone formation that ran under her father's bench was the Kettner Formation, which the survey notes described as a regional aquifer system, recharged from the high plateau to the east, with documented springs along the fault lines where it intersected the valley floor. Someone had written in the margin, in pencil, probably 30 years ago, "Good yield if you can get to it." She drove home and sat with that for a few days. What she was thinking was this: if the Kettner Formation ran under her bench at the depth the auger suggested, and if it held water the way it held water in the valley springs, then her 40 acres of worthless ridgeland might be sitting on top of something that the valley farms. with their deep clay soils and their shallow wells, did not have access to. She might be wrong. She probably was wrong, or at least the scale of it might be wrong. But the aquifer was there. She had felt the moisture at 14 inches in late July. That was not nothing. She wrote a letter to the State Geological Survey Office in the capital and asked if there was any published research on the Kettner Formation yield rates. She also wrote to the Agriculture Extension Service and asked if they had records of any wells drilled in the Eastern Ridge area and what depths they had encountered water. Then she borrowed $300 from her mother's sister and bought the materials to fix the stone foundation. People in Millhaven knew about this because Millhaven was the kind of town where people knew things. Harlan County had maybe 4,000 people spread across a lot of square miles of rangeland and dryland farm, and the town of Millhaven, with its grain co-op and its hardware store and its diner and its one stoplight, was where information collected and moved. Lena had grown up here. She knew how it worked. What they said was not cruel, exactly. It was the kind of thing people say when they think they're being practical. Ed Tarver, who ran the hardware store, mentioned to someone that Thomas Voss's daughter was spending money she didn't have on land that wasn't worth having. This was said with a kind of sighing regret, the way you'd talk about a person who'd made a foolish bet. Donna Shelp, who worked the counter at the diner, said she'd heard the girl was going to try to live up on the ridge, and that she personally would like to see how that went come February. This was said with a smile, not a mean one, but the kind of smile that carries inside it a certainty about how things will turn out. Gerald Hook said nothing directly, but he had a way of pausing when her name came up, a small pause that let other people fill in the space with whatever they were already thinking. Lena heard some of this and didn't hear some of it. She was busy. She hired 2 men from the valley, migrants who were working through the county that summer, and paid them a fair wage to help her lay block on the old foundation. The building she was putting up was not large, a single room with a sleeping loft, with the north wall set into the hillside for insulation, with a porch on the south side that would catch the winter sun. She had designed it herself on graph paper over several evenings, accounting for the slope, the prevailing wind, the angle of the sun in December. Her father had been methodical, and she had learned that from him too. While they worked on the building, she dug test holes at 4 locations across the bench, mapping the depth to the limestone and the moisture content at each point. The letter from the Geological Survey came back in August with 3 pages of technical notes and a map showing the Kettner Formation's extent. The letter from the Extension Service took longer, but when it came, it included a file of water well logs from a dozen locations in the county, and 2 of those wells, both on the eastern slope, had hit good water at depths between 80 and 110 feet. 80 to 110 feet. That was within reach. She did not have money for a commercial drilling rig. She looked into it and found that a professional well drill in this county ran about $22 a foot, which put even an 80-foot well out of range. She thought about this problem for several weeks while the building went up around her. What she found was a man named Dutch Rafferty, who was not from this county and who ran a small cable tool rig out of a barn 2 counties south. Cable tool drilling was old technology, slow, but the equipment was cheaper to rent, and Dutch Rafferty charged by the day rather than by the foot, and he was willing to work for a share arrangement on any water she found, which meant she could start without the money she didn't have. She moved onto the property in September, into a building that was finished but barely. The windows were in, the roof was on, the wood stove was set, but the floor was still bare concrete. She had a cot, a camp stove, a lantern, and 2 boxes of food. She had a water barrel she filled from a spring 3 miles away. The building, when people from town drove up out of curiosity that fall, was not what they expected. It was small and plain, but it was well made. The north wall was earth-bermed, which kept the temperature stable. The south-facing windows were sized to let in low winter sun. There was a root cellar beneath the floor, accessible through a hatch, which stayed 45 degrees year-round because of its depth and its contact with the hillside. She had set posts for a small greenhouse attached to the south side, using salvaged glass from a church that had come down in the next county. She heard what people said about it. She did not need to go to town to hear it. These things travel in a county like this. The general view was that she was doing it wrong, or doing it for the wrong reasons, or doing something that couldn't be done at all. The land was poor, The location was remote. The girl was 23 and had no husband and no particular backing from anyone, and had already used up most of her goodwill credit by inheriting a debt and a piece of ground nobody wanted. There was a specific kind of pity that gets extended to people who are seen to be failing in slow motion, and Lena Voss collected that pity through the fall like it was weather. She found it clarifying in a way she would not have been able to explain to anyone at the time. It removed the noise. There was no advice coming that was going to be useful, so she stopped listening for it. There was no approval available, so she stopped measuring herself against it. What was left was the work and the land, and the question she was trying to answer. Dutch Rafferty brought his rig up in October, when the ground had firmed enough to get the truck up the ridge road. He was a heavy-set man in his 60s who wore the same canvas jacket every day, and who ate his lunch sitting on the running board of his truck. He was not unfriendly, but he didn't talk much during work hours, which suited her. She worked beside him, learning the rig, managing the baling and the cuttings, keeping notes on everything that came up from below. The drilling was slow. Cable tool rigs work by raising and dropping a weighted bit, cracking the rock by percussion, and it took them 11 days to reach 60 feet. The cuttings were limestone all the way down, gray and white, with occasional bands of dark shale. At 62 feet, the cuttings changed color, becoming a darker gray with visible crystalline structure, and at 68 feet, the baling bucket came up wet, not damp, wet. Water standing in the bucket, clear and cold, smelling of minerals. Dutch Rafferty set down his coffee cup and looked at her. He didn't say anything. He pulled the baler again, and this time let it fill and counted the gallons. Then he sat on the running board for a while. "That's a decent well," he said finally. She kept her face still. "How decent?" He did the math out loud. What he described was a yield of approximately 4 to 5 gallons per minute, which was more than enough for household use and small-scale irrigation both, and which was, as he pointed out with some specificity, considerably more than most of the valley farms were getting from their shallow wells, even in a good year. She stood at the edge of the drill site looking out over the bench. The valley below was brown, everything parched down to the root. The sky was pale, the kind of pale it got in October when the rain that should have come in September hadn't. She thought about her grandfather. She thought about the penciled note in the margin of the survey map. She thought about her father standing in this same general piece of country when she was small, holding a handful of dirt and showing her the way it crumbled. She did not cry. She had not cried since the funeral, and she was not going to start now in front of Dutch Rafferty. But something in her chest released, a tension she had been carrying since July without quite knowing she was carrying it. The drought the following year was the worst in living memory. It came on slow, the way the serious ones do. February was dry. March was dry. April produced 0.6 of an inch where the 30-year average was 3. By June, the small creeks had stopped running. The pastures were burning brown by the second week of the month, and the county agent was holding emergency meetings in the Millhaven Community Hall about emergency hay supplies and livestock water. Lena had spent the winter running a pipe from the well to the greenhouse, and laying in the garden beds she'd been planning since September. She had 20 raised beds built from rough lumber, filled with a mix she'd made from compost and the darker subsoil she'd stripped from the building site. She had the greenhouse producing by February, lettuce, spinach, radishes, the things that like cool weather. And by April she had transplants in the ground outside. She had also, that winter, dug a second well. She had done it herself this time, using the hand auger and a method she'd read about in an 1890s agricultural bulletin that the Geological Survey librarian had found for her. The second well was shallower and lower yielding, drilled at the north end of the bench where the limestone was closest to the surface, and it was meant not for drinking water, but for irrigation, piped by gravity to a small holding tank she'd built from salvaged concrete blocks. She had calculated the water budget over the winter, working through it on paper evening after evening. The aquifer recharge rates from the survey data, the evapotranspiration rates for the crops she was planting, the storage capacity of the tank, the seasonal variation. She had filled a whole composition notebook with numbers and gone back through them 3 times. By June, when the rest of the county was watching their wells drop, hers were holding. People started coming up the ridge road that summer. Not many at first. A neighbor from 2 miles down, then a family from the valley she didn't know well. They came to look, mostly. They stood on the edge of her bench and looked at the garden beds, which were green and producing when everything else in the county was dust. They didn't say much. Some of them had said things back in the fall, or had heard things and not corrected them, and there was an awkwardness to standing in front of evidence that the fool had been right. She didn't make it awkward. She showed them the beds, answered their questions plainly. A woman named Helen Parr from down the valley asked her how deep the well was and what it was yielding, and Lena told her the exact numbers. Helen Parr went home and told her husband, and her husband went to the county agent, and the county agent drove up the following week. His name was Roy Cheswick, and he had been in this county for 16 years, and he was not the kind of man who apologized easily, but he walked the bench with her for 2 hours and asked careful questions, and at the end of it he said, "Miss Voss, I don't know that I understood this ridge the way I should have." It was not an apology, but it was something. By July, with the drought hardening and the valley farms in genuine crisis, cattle being sold early, hay being trucked in from 2 states over, 3 families she knew of talking about leaving, Roy Cheswick called a meeting in the community hall. He had brought a hydrologist from the state university, a young man named Patterson, who had looked at the geological survey data and at Lena's well logs, which she had provided, and who stood at the front of the hall and explained to 47 farmers and their families what a confined aquifer was and what the Kettner Formation represented and what it might mean for the eastern slope of the ridge. Lena sat in the back row and listened. What Patterson was describing was essentially what her grandfather had told her when she was 9 years old, rendered in the technical language of hydrology. The water was there. It had always been there. The valley farms sat on clay that sealed them off from it. The Ridgeland, the land nobody had wanted, the land that had been passed over and written off, sat directly on top of it. She had not come to the meeting to say anything, but Roy Cheswick called on her, and she stood up and answered questions for 40 minutes. What struck her later was not the questions themselves, but the quality of attention in the room. These were people who had been farming this county for generations, some of them, and they were listening to a 23-year-old woman explain hydrology because they were desperate enough to listen to anything, and because she was the one person in the room who had put the theory into practice and come out the other side with green rows of vegetables and full water tanks. Ed Tarver was in the 3rd row. Donna Shelp was near the middle. Gerald Hoke was not there, which she noticed and then put out of her mind. She answered every question she could and said plainly when she didn't know the answer. She gave out her phone number and said anyone who wanted to come up and see the setup was welcome to come. The next 2 months were the hardest she had been through, and also, she thought later, the most interesting. 14 families drilled wells on the eastern slope that summer and fall, following the geological data she'd helped Patterson compile and the well log records she had kept through her own drilling. Not all of them struck the Kettner Formation. The aquifer had a specific geometry, and 2 of the wells came up dry, which was painful, and she felt those failures personally even though they weren't her failures. 10 of the 14 found water. The yields varied, but 8 of those 10 were productive enough to carry livestock through the drought and into spring. Roy Cheswick filed a report with the state. Patterson published a paper, the County Irrigation District, which had existed on paper for years without much function, held its first real meeting in October and elected a water board that included, after some discussion that she heard about secondhand, Lena Voss. She was not the first woman on the water board. She was the youngest person on it by 11 years. The drought broke the following March, a slow soaking rain that lasted 4 days and filled the creek to the banks and brought the pastures back green. People in Millhaven were cheerful in a way that communities get cheerful after they've come through something hard together, the kind of collective relief that makes people more generous with each other than they usually are. There was a gathering at the community hall. There was food. Ed Tarver shook her hand and said she'd done good work, and she accepted that because it was true and because she was not interested in making it more than that. Gerald Hook came in late and stood near the door. He did not come to speak to her. She watched him for a moment, then turned back to the conversation she'd been having with Helen Parr about a cooperative greenhouse they were thinking about building on the south slope. Some things resolve without confrontation. Some debts get paid in the currency of events, rather than words. Gerald Hook had the mill, which was barely running now that two of the valley's biggest farms had restructured their operations. He had made his practical calculation years ago, and events had made a different calculation in return. That was enough. She had what she needed. The bench on the eastern ridge, which her father had left her, and which no one had wanted, and which she had spent the worst year of her life making into something livable, was now not famous. That wasn't the right word. Known. People knew it. The water board met there sometimes in summer, out on the south porch with coffee, because the view down the valley was good, and the temperature at that elevation was 10 degrees cooler than in town. Patterson had cited the well data in 2 more papers. A woman from the State Conservation Office had come out and walked the property and talked to her about a demonstration site designation, which was still in process. She had added a second greenhouse by the following spring. She had 28 beds in production by summer, growing under drip irrigation fed by the gravity tank, and she'd worked out an arrangement with 3 restaurants in the county seat, 40 miles away, to take her salad greens and early tomatoes at a price that covered her costs, and then some. She was not wealthy. She did not expect to be wealthy, but the debt her father had left was a fixed point in the past now, and the ground she stood on was hers, and the water beneath it was mapped and documented and understood. She still used the folding knife, still dug into the ground in new places when she walked the bench, still held the dark soil in her palm, and read it the way her grandfather had shown her to. Some knowledge lives in the hands before it lives in the head. She had known that a long time. On a morning in late April, with the rain still holding, and the beds coming up and the valley below green for the first time in 2 years, she stood at the edge of the bench and looked out over all of it, the scrub oak, the pale limestone, the distant cottonwoods marking the creek, and she thought about her grandfather sitting on that porch in the evening, talking about the way limestone held water different than clay. He had not been a famous man. He had not written anything down. But something he knew had traveled through 2 generations and arrived here, on this bench, in this season, and made itself useful. That seemed to her like enough.